No one wanted the 400-pound bride, until the mountain man said, "She'd carry my sons." The crowd laughed, the church bell tolled, and a woman everyone mocked was suddenly claimed in front of the whole town. A man scarred by war steps. Forward, not for money, not for land, but for a vow no one expected. But on the dusty street, a shadow waits. A powerful agent of the railroad has his eye on her father's deed, the deed that hides the key to the valley's only spring. With jail keys clanging, ledgers forged, and the law twisting like barbed wire, their new marriage is tested before it's even begun. Will the bride, once shamed by all, become the strength that saves them? Or will greed and lies tear apart the only love brave enough to stand? And when the judge's gavel falls, whose side will the town choose? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The winter wind whipped down Silver Veins Main Street, rattling the weathered sign of Hanson's General Store. A cluster of men gathered on the plank front, their breath frosting in the cold morning air. Betty Mayhew stood alone, her heart pounding beneath her woolen shawl as cruel whispers and jeers circled around her like crows. "Ain't worth more than a worn-out mule," one man called out, drawing snickers from the others. Betty clutched her, Bible tighter, her father's teachings about dignity echoing in her mind, even as tears threatened to spill. The crowd parted as Robert Boone approached, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden planks. Scars marked his weathered face, telling tales of wilderness battles, but his eyes held steady as he reached into his coat. The mockery died when he placed a gleaming gold eagle on the store counter. "She'll carry my sons." His voice carried clear and strong across the sudden hush. Betty's breath caught at the words, spoken not with shame, but with quiet certainty. Reverend Caldwell stepped forward from where he'd been watching with growing dismay. "This stops now," he declared, his ministerial authority cutting through the winter air. "If there's to be a union, it'll be proper and blessed before God." The Reverend led them to the small church, its wooden walls offering shelter from both wind and scorn. By noon, lamplight warmed the simple sanctuary as Betty and Robert stood before the altar. Two Myers who knew Betty's father sat in the front pew, and the schoolmarm dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Do you, Robert Boone, take this woman?" The familiar words filled the quiet space as Reverend Caldwell performed the ceremony with careful dignity. When the rings were exchanged, simple bands that caught the lamp's glow, Robert's large hands were gentle as they held Betty's trembling fingers. After the final prayer, Robert turned to Betty. His voice was low but clear. "I promise you gentleness and honor, before God and these witnesses." The words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, beginning to thaw the morning's frozen shame. They made their way to the mercantile, where Robert methodically selected supplies. The wooden floorboards creaked under their steps as they gathered. Flour in heavy sacks, lamp oil in gleaming tins, and quilts with careful stitching. The storekeeper's wife watched with poorly hidden curiosity as she wrapped their purchases. Near the telegraph office, the clerk looked up from his clicking machine, recognition crossing his face as he saw Betty. "Why, you're Preacher Mayhew's girl," he said. "Holding title to Dry Willow Ranch now that he's passed, ain't you?" Betty nodded, but before she could respond, she noticed a man in a fine Eastern suit, a railroad agent, turned sharply at the clerk's words, his pencil pausing above his notebook dot. The day's light was fading to purple dusk when they reached the parsonage. Robert worked steadily, loading their supplies onto a sturdy sled and securing packs to two patient mules. The animal's breath steamed in the gathering darkness as he checked each rope with careful attention. Inside the parsonage kitchen, warmth from the cook stove wrapped around them as they bowed their heads to pray. Reverend Caldwell's voice was steady as he asked for blessing and protection on their journey. When the prayer ended, Robert rose first. "The back room's made up for you, Betty," he said quietly. "I'll bed down by the stove here. We'll start at first light, when the snow's still hard enough for good traveling." Betty nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. As she closed the door to her temporary room, she heard him laying out his bedroll on the kitchen floor. The day's events washed over her. The morning's cruelty transformed into something unexpected. Dignity, protection, and perhaps the promise of a real home. She touched the simple ring on her finger, remembering Robert's public declaration and his gentle vow in the church. Outside, the wind had settled. Through the small window, Betty could see fresh snow beginning to fall, each flake catching the light from the parsonage lamp. Tomorrow would bring a new path, leading away from Silver Vane's bitter memories toward Dry Willow Ranch and whatever future God had planned for them there. Gray light crept over the mountain peaks as Robert and Betty prepared to leave Silver Vane, their breath clouded in the bitter dawn air while Robert made final adjustments to the wagon's load. The mule strings shuffled restlessly, their hooves crunching in the frozen snow. Betty pulled her shawl tighter, watching Robert work with quiet efficiency. His movements were precise, each rope checked twice, every item secured against the jolting journey ahead. The town still slept, windows dark behind frost-etched panes. "We'll stop at the telegraph office first," Robert said, his low voice carrying in the still morning. "Need to check something." The telegraph office sat at the edge of town, its windows already glowing with early lamplight. The clerk looked up as they entered, recognition crossing his face. "Mrs. Boone," he said, the new name still strange to Betty's ears. "I was hoping to catch you before you left." Robert stood quietly by the door while the clerk rifled through a stack of papers. "Here it is," the man said finally, pulling out a document. "Your father's deed to Dry Willow Ranch, properly recorded. Everything's in order." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "That railroad man, Silas Purdy, came asking about it last week. Seemed mighty interested in the water rights." Robert's expression didn't change, but Betty noticed his shoulders tighten. "Much obliged for telling us," he said, then turned to examine a stack of heavy canvas. "We'll take this too. Good for windproofing." They left town as the sun cleared the ridge, the wagon wheels creaking through fresh snow. Betty sat straight on the wagon seat, determined not to look back at the place that held so many memories, both bitter and sweet. Robert handled the reins, with careful attention, guiding the team along the rutted trail. By midday, they reached a frozen creek where bare willows stood like sentinels against the pale sky. Robert helped Betty down from the wagon, his strong hands steady at her waist. "Best to rest the animals," he said, already gathering dry branches for a fire. Betty unwrapped the food. She'd packed bacon and biscuits saved from yesterday's baking. She watched as Robert built a small fire with practiced ease, arranging the wood to catch quickly despite the wind. "Here," he said, motioning her closer to the flames. "Hold your hands like this." He demonstrated, palms out at just the right distance. Too close and you'll scorch them. Too far and you won't get the benefit. Betty followed his example, grateful for the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the simple meal. Betty noticed how Robert positioned himself to block the worst of the wind from reaching her. Such quiet thoughtfulness, she reflected, was worth more than flowery words or grand gestures. The peaceful moment was broken by the sudden thunder of hooves. A rider galloped past on the main trail, heading back towards Silver Vane. Betty recognized him as one of Purdy's men, no doubt carrying news of their departure. "He'll tell Purdy we've gone," she said softly. Robert nodded, already beginning to pack up their brief camp. "Then we'd best keep moving." As afternoon faded toward evening, thin snow began to fall. Robert studied the darkening sky with experienced eyes. "Storm's coming in stronger than I'd like," he said. "There's a line shack ahead, Basic shelter, but it'll serve. The line shack proved to be a sturdy box of a building with a stone fire pit at its center. They reached it just as the snow began to thicken, wind starting to moan through the pine trees. Robert worked quickly to settle the animals in the lean-to, while Betty swept the dirt floor and laid out their quilts. They prayed together over a simple supper, asking God's protection through the night. Robert split their last stick of kindling with careful precision, building a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. Betty watched the flames for a moment, gathering her courage. "This morning," she said quietly, "when you spoke of sons." She paused, uncertain how to continue. Robert sat still, his scarred hands clasped loosely between his knees. "After the war," he said slowly, "I never thought to have a family. Lived alone in the high country, trapping. Seemed easier that way." He looked at her directly. "But sons, that means hope. A future worth building." The wind rose outside, whining around the eaves of the little shelter. Robert spread his bedroll near the door, positioning himself between Betty and whatever might come in the night. Betty settled onto the narrow bunk, pulling the quilts close. "We'll start again at daybreak," Robert said, his voice gentle in the darkness. "Get some rest." The fire crackled softly as they both prepared for sleep, each aware of the other's presence, each wondering what tomorrow would bring to their new-formed union. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The night storm had left everything crusted in white, the snow gleaming like sugar in the pale morning light. Robert moved carefully around the line shack, his boots crunching through the frozen crust as he prepared the team for another day's journey. Betty watched from the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. The mules stood patient in their traces while Robert checked each harness twice, his fingers working deliberately in the cold. The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, breaking fresh tracks through the deep drifts. "Going to be slower than usual," Robert said, guiding the team with steady hands. "Snow's deeper than I expected this early in the season." They traveled at half their previous day's pace, the wagon laboring through the heavy snow. Betty noticed how Robert chose their path carefully, reading the terrain like a book. He guided them around the worst drifts, finding firmer ground where he could dot by noon. They reached a sheltered hollow where bare-branched aspens offered some protection from the wind. Robert halted the team, concerned for the mules' stamina. "Need to rest them proper," he explained, helping Betty down from the wagon seat. "It's all uphill to my valley from here." The afternoon brought them steadily higher into the mountains. Betty marveled at how the landscape changed, pines growing thicker, the air becoming sharper with altitude. Robert seemed to grow more alert as they climbed, like a man approaching home after a long absence. Late afternoon sun gilded the snow when they finally crested a high ridge. Robert drew the wagon to a halt, allowing Betty her first view of their destination. Below them stretched a narrow valley, sheltered by steep walls of rock and forest. Near a glinting ribbon of spring-fed water stood a cabin, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. "You're home," Betty said softly. "Our home now," Robert corrected, gentle but firm. The cabin was a single room, built solid of hand-hewn logs. Robert immediately set to work at the iron stove, adding wood and adjusting drafts with practiced motions. Betty took stock of her new domain. Rough plank shelves lined one wall. A narrow bed occupied another, and simple furnishings filled the space between. While Robert tended to the mules and unloaded their supplies, Betty set about making the cabin livable. She shook out quilts, wiped down dusty shelves, and set a pot of beans with salt pork to simmer on the stove. The familiar tasks helped settle her nerves about this new chapter in her life. Robert returned and stood in the doorway, watching her work. "Need to tell you the rules of this place," he said carefully. "No liquor allowed. All rifles stay unloaded inside. We observe the Lord's Day proper." He paused, then added with quiet respect, "And we won't share a bed until you say you're ready." Betty nodded, appreciating his directness and his consideration. As she stirred the beans, she began to sing softly, "Nearer, my God, to thee." The hymn filled the cabin with a gentle peace that seemed to make the space feel more like home. The twilight peace shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Robert moved to the door, one hand near his holster, as a rider approached through the gathering dusk. The man's coat bore the distinctive spade symbol of the railroad company, one of Purdy's men. Without dismounting, the courier withdrew a printed notice from his saddlebag. "For the resident of Dry Willow Ranch," he announced formally, extending the paper toward them. Robert took it without comment. The rider wheeled his horse around and spurred away before either of them could speak, vanishing into the deepening shadows between the trees. Betty's hands trembled as she unfolded the document. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear enough. The railroad was challenging their deed and claiming rights to the spring for their survey lines. Her father's legacy, her rightful inheritance, all threatened by Purdy's schemes. Robert's weathered hand covered hers, steadying the shaking paper. "We'll answer this proper," he said firmly. "In court, with the law. Not with guns." His voice carried the weight of experience, of a man who had seen enough violence to know better ways. They knelt together by lamplight, the notice lying between them on the rough floorboards. Betty's voice joined Robert's as they asked for divine guidance, for wisdom to face what lay ahead. The iron stove crackled softly as Robert banked the fire for the night, its warm glow holding back the darkness beyond their walls. Morning arrived with crystal clarity, the sky above their valley and infinite blue. Frost sparkled on the cabin's small window panes as Betty stirred up the fire and Robert retrieved 2 pairs of snowshoes from the rafters. "These here keep you from sinking," Robert explained, showing Betty the web of rawhide laced across wooden frames. His fingers worked deftly, replacing worn lacings with fresh ones. "Your father ever teach you to use these?" Betty shook her head, watching intently as Robert demonstrated how to secure them to her boots. "Step wide and easy," he instructed, helping her find her balance in the yard. "Keep your feet apart, like you're following wagon tracks." He steadied her with a gentle hand when she wobbled. "That's it. Don't twist at the ankle. Lift straight. Up and forward." Betty concentrated on each step, determined to master this essential winter skill. After several trips across the yard, her movements grew more confident. Robert nodded with approval as she made a full circuit without stumbling. Inside the cabin, they turned their attention to winter preparations. Betty opened cupboards and counted supplies while Robert made notes in his ledger. "Flour's low," she reported. "Maybe 3 weeks' worth. Salt pork will last longer, but we'll need more coffee soon." Robert added items to his list. "Might be time to smoke some beef too, before the weather turns meaner." Betty settled at the table with Robert's spare coat, examining worn spots in the leather. She cut patches from a sturdy flour sack, her needle flying as she reinforced the elbows with neat stitches. The familiar work filled the quiet morning hours. Near midday, Robert dozed in his chair by the stove. Without warning, his body jerked violently, and a hoarse shout escaped his throat. His eyes flew open, wild and unceiing. Betty set aside her mending and moved carefully to his side. She settled on the floor next to his chair, close but not touching, and began to hum Amazing Grace. The familiar melody filled the cabin as she waited patiently. Gradually, Robert's ragged breathing steadied, his fingers unclenched from the chair arms. "Or dreams," he said roughly, after a long silence. Betty nodded, continuing to hum softly until the tension left his shoulders completely. In the afternoon, they walked the property's boundaries together, checking fences. Fresh snow held clear. Tracks near the calf pen, the distinctive prints of coyotes. They're getting bold, Robert observed, examining the marks. He withdrew his single-action Colt, checking the cylinder. This stays unloaded in the house, up high where it can't bring trouble, he reminded Betty. But out here, we keep it ready. Betty understood the wisdom of both practices. Her father had taught similar rules about firearms: respect without fear, caution without carelessness. As evening approached, they discussed plans for protecting their land claim. Need to ride to the county seat, Robert said, spreading their map on the table. Get a certified copy of your deed from the courthouse. Talk to a lawyer who knows water rights. Betty traced the route with her finger. How long? Day down day. Back, if the weather holds. Robert folded the map carefully. But first, we should attend church in town Sunday. Show folks we're proper married folk, not hiding up here. Betty nodded, already mentally planning what they would need. She moved around the cabin, gathering supplies for Robert's journey. Jerky wrapped in wax paper, coffee beans in a tin, matches in an oilskin pouch. She added a folded shawl, knowing the temperature could drop sudden and sharp. The cabin filled with the rich aroma of rabbit stew as they finalized their plans over supper. I'll leave at dawn Monday, Robert said, breaking cornbread into his bowl. Should make town by nightfall, handle business Tuesday. Be back Wednesday if all goes smooth. I'll be fine here, Betty assured him, seeing the question in his eyes. Got plenty to keep me busy, and I know how to work that rifle if needed. Robert nodded, satisfied. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the iron stove ticking as it cooled. Outside, a coyote called once across the valley, but neither of them startled at the sound. They were home, and they would defend what was theirs, with law first, but with whatever means necessary if pushed. The Lord knows what's right, Betty said softly, gathering their bowls. We just need to stand firm and trust His timing. The Sunday dawn painted the valley in crystalline light, every snow-laden branch glittering like diamonds. Betty smoothed her best dress, the dark blue wool carefully pressed, while Robert hitched the team to their wagon. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they began their descent towards Silver Vein. Might be some talk, Robert warned quietly as the town's church spire came into view. Folk ain't always kind. Betty squared her shoulders. The Lord sees past all that, she replied, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. The church stood proud against the winter sky, its white-painted boards gleaming. As they entered the vestibule, whispers rustled like dry leaves. Betty caught fragments about her size, about the auction that had brought her and Robert together. Her cheeks burned, but she held her head high. Then Lila Greyhawk appeared at Betty's elbow, her two small sons trailing behind her like shadows. The Comanche widow's presence carried a quiet dignity that seemed to push back against the whispers. Share our pew? Lila offered, her dark eyes kind. My boys like singing hymns. Betty felt tears prick her eyes at this simple kindness. Much obliged, she managed, following Lila to a bench near the middle of the church. Reverend Caldwell's familiar figure took the pulpit, his Bible well worn and trusted in his hands. He opened to Luke, chapter 15, and began to speak of lost things found, the sheep, the coin, the prodigal son. His words wrapped around Betty like a warm shawl as he spoke of dignity restored and value recognized. The Father's love sees worth where others see waste, the Reverend declared, his voice carrying to every corner. His grace lifts up those the world casts aside. After the service, the congregation gathered for the potluck dinner in the church. The basement, Betty had brought cornbread, still warm from their morning baking. She set it among the other dishes, trying to ignore the sideways glances some women cast her way. A man in a crisp coat marked with railroad insignia sidled up to Robert, who stood protective at Betty's shoulder. Here, tell you squatting on. "Company water up there," the surveyor said, his smile sharp as a cactus thorn. Before Robert could respond, Betty turned to face the man. Her voice came out clear and steady, surprising even herself. "The Mayhew deed names that spring proper. Dry Willow it's called. Lists every boundary tree around it too." The surveyor's smile stiffened like winter-killed grass. His eyes narrowed as he studied Betty more carefully. Reverend Caldwell approached their small group, his presence diffusing the tension. "I recall something about that deed," he said thoughtfully. "Brother Mayhew had me mark it with scripture. Ribbons, as I remember. Asked me to witness any future transfer, along with the reservation agency clerk." He paused, looking meaningfully at the surveyor. "A condition meant to protect all the neighbors' interests, you understand." The surveyor retreated without another word, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. As afternoon light slanted through the church windows, Robert and Betty made their way to the general store. While Robert gathered supplies for his journey, Betty leafed through seed catalogs, dreaming of spring gardens. The sky was deepening toward dusk when Reverend Caldwell caught them at their wagon. In his hands he held a Bible, its leather cover scratched and worn with years of use. "Your father's," he said softly, holding it out to Betty. "Found these tucked inside." 2 blue ribbons marked pages near where the deed description was copied. "Might be worth keeping close." Betty cradled the Bible against her chest, feeling the weight of its history. "Thank you, Reverend," she whispered. Robert helped Betty into the wagon, then climbed up beside her. The lantern he hung on the wagon bow cast a gentle glow as they started the journey home. They spoke quietly of his planned departure at first light, what route he'd take, when to expect him back, how to signal if trouble came. The valley waited above them, their small cabin a darker shape against the starlit snow. Betty held her father's Bible close, drawing strength from its familiar presence. Whatever challenges the railroad might bring, they would face them together, with law and faith to guide their way. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Betty like a thick blanket. As she helped Robert prepare for his journey, her fingers trembled slightly as she tied his saddlebags closed, checking one last time that she'd packed enough coffee and dried beef for the ride. Robert mounted his bay gelding, the leather saddle creaking in the crisp morning air. Steam rose from his tin cup of coffee as he took a final sip. "Should be back by nightfall," he said, his voice quiet in the stillness. Betty nodded, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. She stood at the cabin door, watching as Robert guided his horse toward the ridge. The sky was just beginning to lighten, turning the snow-covered ground into a sea of pale blue shadows. When horse and rider finally disappeared over the crest, she turned back to face the empty cabin. She prepared a list of tasks the night before, written carefully on a scrap of paper. Keeping busy would help the hours pass. Betty stoked the fire first, then gathered the washing. As she worked, she recited the deed's words aloud, committing each detail to memory. The spring known as Dry Willow, marked by 3 lightning-struck pines to the north. Her voice filled the quiet cabin as she scrubbed and rinsed. The familiar words brought comfort, like verses from scripture. Near noon, sleigh bells jingled outside. Betty peered through the window to see midwife Alma Pritchard climbing down from her sleigh, her medical bag in hand. The older woman's face was pink from the cold above her thick wool scarf. "Thought I'd pay a courtesy call," Alma said as Betty opened the door. "News travels fast about marriages in these parts." Betty welcomed her in, grateful for the company. She hung the midwife's heavy coat near the stove and poured them both cups of the soup she'd been simmering since morning. After they'd eaten, Alma's expression grew more serious. "Now then," she said gently, "might we talk about your health? As a midwife, I like to look after all my ladies, married or not." Betty nodded, though her cheeks flushed. Alma's examination was thorough but discreet, her experienced hands gentle. She showed Betty how to breathe deeply, suggested short walks to build strength, and listed foods that would help prepare her body. Childbearing is possible, Alma finally sighed, her kind eyes meeting Betty's. With watchfulness and prayer, mind you, but possible all the same. Tears welled in Betty's eyes. She tried not to hope, after years of hearing whispered doubts about her size and worth. Alma squeezed her hand firmly. "I'll come again soon," the midwife promised. "We'll work on this together." After Alma left, Betty noticed dark clouds building in the western sky. The afternoon light grew dim earlier than usual as the storm approached. She kept glancing toward the ridge, but Robert didn't appear. Twilight settled heavily around the cabin. Betty built up the fire and hung a kettle to sing on the stove, its cheerful sound pushing back against the growing darkness. She lit the lamp and pulled out her inventory notebook, recording their supplies and planning what they'd need for the coming weeks. Around midnight, the wind rose to a howl, slamming the wooden shutters against the cabin walls. Betty jumped at each bang, then forced herself to breathe slowly, the way Alma had shown her. Opening her father's Bible, she whispered the 23rd Psalm, letting the familiar words calm her racing heart. She must have dozed off in the chair because the next thing she knew, gray dawn light was seeping through the windows. Her neck ached from the awkward position, and the fire had burned low. Then she heard it, hoofbeats approaching through the snow. The door swung open with a blast of cold air. Robert stepped through, his coat and hat covered in ice, his face red from the bitter wind. "Storm caught me," he said, apologetic relief clear in his voice. "Had to wait it out in a line shack." Betty hurried to help him with his frozen coat. "You're home now," she said softly. "That's what matters." Robert's weathered face softened as he looked at her. In that moment, Betty felt the truth of it. This was home now, for both of them. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the railroad, they would face them together. The kettle still sang on the stove as morning light filled their small cabin. Betty reached for the coffee pot, ready to warm her husband's hands and heart with a fresh cup, while outside the storm-clearing dawn painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pearl and gold. Robert held his frozen hands over the warm stove while Betty poured fresh coffee into his tin cup. Once feeling returned to his fingers, he reached into his coat and pulled out several papers, carefully protected in oilskin. "Found what we needed?" he said, laying them on the table. The certified deed copy gleamed with fresh ink and an official seal. Betty leaned closer, her finger tracing the clear words describing their water right at Dry Willow Spring. "Look here," Robert said, pointing to a section near the bottom. "Your father was mighty careful. Says plain as day that any transfer needs both Reverend Caldwell and the reservation agency clerk as witnesses." His weathered face showed respect for the old preacher's foresight. Betty nodded, remembering her father's dedication to fair dealings. He always said good fences make good neighbors, but good witnesses make better ones. Robert pulled out another paper, a note written in a lawyer's careful hand. "Counsel says we need to get this before a judge soon as possible. Wants us to bring our witnesses for an affirmation hearing." They discussed timing over hot coffee and the last of breakfast. The storm had left deep drifts, but a warming spell was coming. 2 days should let the road settle, Robert said. "We can ride down Thursday if the weather holds." Betty agreed, already mentally listing what they'd need to prepare. "We'll want to be ready in case we're held overnight in town." They spent Tuesday afternoon tending to essential tasks. Robert checked each animal in the barn while Betty mixed fresh feed. Together, they mended harness leather, Robert showing Betty how to double-stitch the worn spots for extra strength. "Ain't pretty," Betty said, examining her stitches. "Don't need pretty," Robert replied. "Just needs to hold." His quiet approval made her smile. Wednesday morning brought clear skies and hard work. They hitched the team to the wood sled, hauling load after load of split logs to stack against the cabin wall. Robert wielded the axe while Betty managed the horses, both of them knowing a good wood supply meant security by afternoon. They turned to smoking meat, salt pork, and beef that needed preserving. Betty tended the smokehouse fire while Robert trimmed cuts, neither wanting to leave anything that might spoil during their absence. The evening brought unexpected trouble. A young heifer was struggling with her first calf, the birth going wrong. Robert found her straining in the pen and called for Betty. "Going to be a long night," he said grimly, rolling up his sleeves. Betty hurried to the cabin and stoked the stove, setting water to boil. She gathered clean cloths, tearing old sheets into strips and sterilizing them in boiling water. Each time Robert called, she brought fresh hot water to the pen. They worked in shifts through the dark hours. Robert stayed with the heifer, his strong hands gentle as he helped position the calf. Betty moved between cabin and barn, keeping water hot, preparing clean cloths, and praying steadily under her breath. Near midnight, Robert's voice rang out with joy. "He's breathing!" Betty hurried out with a fresh lantern. The newborn calf lay in clean straw, wet and wobbling, but alive. Its mother licked it vigorously while Robert supported its head. Steam rose from their clothes in the cold night air as they bowed their heads together. "Thank you, Lord," Betty whispered, and Robert's quiet amen followed. Back in the cabin, they began preparing for tomorrow's journey. Betty laid out their court clothes, Robert's good coat and her best dress, brushed free of dust. She wrapped the deed and her father's Bible carefully in clean cloth, then packed a small food satchel with bread, cheese, and dried apples. Robert stepped outside one last time to check the sky. He came back nodding. "Stars are sharp and clear. Weather's breaking just right." They would leave at dawn, ready to face whatever challenges waited in town. The certified deed lay protected on the table, their witness requirements clear. Tomorrow they would collect Reverend Caldwell and the agency clerk, then stand together before the judge. Betty banked the fire for the night while Robert checked their packs one final time. The cabin settled around them, creaking softly in the cold. Outside, the stars glittered like ice, promising clear trails for their morning ride to town. The Thursday dawn spread across the sky in hard blue streaks. Frost sparkled on the wagon seat as Betty and Robert set out for town, the wheels crunching over frozen ruts. Robert handled the reins with care, mindful of the icy patches that could startle their team. "Beautiful morning the Lord's given us," Betty said, adjusting her shawl against the chill. Robert nodded, his breath making clouds in the cold air. They were approaching a bend in the trail, where willows drooped their bare branches over the path when shadows moved between the trees. Robert's hands tightened on the reins as several men stepped onto the road ahead. Betty recognized them as Purdy's hired hands by their work clothes bearing the railroad's mark. Robert slowed the wagon, keeping his hands visible and away from his holster. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice steady and calm. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a week's growth of beard, thrust a paper toward them. "Got an injunction here says that Spring's company property. You're trespassing on railroad land." "That paper is false as a brass nickel," Robert replied evenly. "We're headed to see the judge right now about our deed." The foreman's face darkened. Two men grabbed Robert's arms while another yanked him from the wagon seat. Betty cried out as the foreman's fist connected with Robert's temple, sending him stumbling. "Robert!" Betty's voice rang through the cold morning air. "You have no right. We're on our way to a legal hearing." Hoofbeats approached, and a deputy rode up, his badge glinting dully in the morning light. Betty recognized him as one of the men often seen in Purdy's company at the saloon. "What's the trouble here?" the deputy asked, though his lazy tone suggested he already knew. "Caught this squatter trespassing on railroad property," the foreman said, roughly securing Robert's hands behind his back. Reckon I'd better hold him at the jail until this gets sorted out, the deputy drawled, patting his horse's neck. For his own protection, you understand. You go on home now, ma'am, one of the men told Betty with false politeness. Best mind your stove and leave this to the menfolk. Betty drew herself up straight, her father's strength flowing through her voice. I will not. She clicked to the team and guided the wagon after the deputy's horse, keeping Robert in sight as they made their slow way toward town. The afternoon sun was slanting long shadows across Silver Veins Main Street when they finally reached the jail. Betty watched helplessly as they locked Robert in a cell on a trumped-up trespass charge. Through the window, she saw Silas Purdy stride into the courthouse, papers in hand, his petition to invalidate their deed. Betty stood outside the jail, clutching her father's Bible with its blue ribbons marking the deed description. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Betty! Reverend Caldwell hurried across the street toward her, his face creased with concern. I just heard. This is an outrage before God and man. Before Betty could respond, Lila Greyhawk appeared at her side, carrying a covered pot and a thick blanket. You'll need to keep up your strength, Lila said softly, pressing the warm container into Betty's hands. The broth will help. The deputy emerged from the jail, twirling his keys. No visitors until morning, he announced with obvious satisfaction. Judge's orders. Darkness was falling over the town as Betty stood her ground, unwilling to leave. The Reverend touched her arm gently. You can't stay here all night, child. The schoolmarm, Miss Sarah Whitfield, approached through the gathering gloom. I've spoken with Reverend Caldwell. There's a bedroll waiting for you at the parsonage. Please come with me. Betty looked one last time at the jail's dark windows, then nodded slowly. In the parsonage's spare room, she knelt beside the borrowed bedroll. Tears finally flowed as she prayed, her father's Bible pressed close to her heart, the blue ribbons marking their claim to the land God had entrusted to them dot through her tears. She whispered the 23rd Psalm, clinging to its promise of green pastures and still waters. Outside, the winter wind keened around the eaves of the parsonage, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed the ache in her heart. The winter sunrise painted the jailhouse walls in pale gold as Betty waited by the iron-barred door. Her breath made small clouds in the cold morning air. The deputy took his time with the keys, metal scraping against metal before he finally led her down the narrow corridor. Robert stood at the bars of his cell, his temple bruised but his eyes clear and steady. Betty pressed her hand through the iron squares, and his rough fingers closed around hers. 5 minutes, the deputy drawled, leaning against the wall. Stand firm, Robert whispered, his voice low enough that only Betty could hear. Truth is with you. The Lord knows our claim. Is right. Right. Betty nodded, trying to memorize every detail of his face. Too soon, the deputy's boots scraped against the wooden floor. Time's up. Outside in the crisp morning air, Lila Greyhawk waited, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. I have news that might help, she said, falling into step beside Betty. Thomas Red Elk is in town today. He's delivering the annuity ledgers to the army post. Betty's heart lifted. The agency clerk? The very same, Lila confirmed. And he knows every word of every deed filed with the reservation office. They found Reverend Caldwell on the church steps, his Bible tucked under one arm. When Lila mentioned Thomas Red Elk's presence, the preacher's eyes brightened. The deed clause requires his witness, he said. We should speak with him directly. The three made their way to the army post, snow crunching beneath their boots. Captain Merriweather received them in his office, a spare room warmed by a pot-bellied stove. The captain listened gravely as Reverend Caldwell explained the situation. There have been brawls before when the railroad pushed its claims, the captain said, stroking his mustache. "I can detail Sergeant Matthews to keep order during the hearing. He's level-headed and knows the local troublemakers." "Much obliged." "Captain," Betty said softly. They found Thomas Red Elk in the post-record room, his careful handwriting filling fresh pages in the annuity books. He looked up as they entered, his face composed and thoughtful. Betty laid the deed copy before him. Thomas studied it carefully, his finger tracing the lines of text. "This witness clause," he said, "was written with purpose. Too many predatory sales happen near native water rights. Your father was wise to include this protection." He stood, straightening his agency clerk's jacket. "I will attend the hearing. The reservation's boundary survey copy may prove useful as well." The afternoon sun slanted through the church windows as Betty sat with Reverend Caldwell at his desk. Her pen scratched across paper as she drafted her statement, keeping to simple facts: the deed's provenance, her father's careful arrangements, the spring's documented boundaries. "Plain truth needs no ornament," the Reverend said, nodding as he read her words. When shadows began to lengthen, Lila brought fresh bread and soup to the parsonage kitchen. A small group gathered around the worn table: Betty, the Reverend, Lila and her 2 young sons, and Thomas Red Elk. Steam rose from their bowls as they bowed heads in prayer. "The Lord watches over the sojourner," Reverend Caldwell quoted softly. "He upholds the widow and the fatherless." As evening drew its purple veil across the sky, they moved to the church for vespers. Betty's hands trembled slightly as she lit a stubby candle, its flame steady in the gathering dark. She placed her father's Bible and the deed carefully on the altar rail. The familiar words of "Abide with me" rose in her throat, and she began to hum the hymn's gentle melody. The sound filled the empty church, wrapping around the wooden pews like a comfort. On a bench near the back, Lila's boys curled against their mother's side, their eyes growing heavy. Betty watched the candle flame dance, casting warm light on the deed's careful script and the Bible's worn leather cover. Outside, the winter wind whispered around the church's corners, but inside, in this moment of peace, she felt her father's presence and the strength of the friends God had provided, each one a light against the darkness, each one standing ready to uphold what was right. The courthouse filled steadily through Saturday morning, wood floors creaking under heavy boots as townspeople shuffled in. Betty sat straight-backed on a hard bench near the front, her father's Bible and the deed lying carefully in her lap. Reverend Caldwell settled beside her, while Thomas Red Elk stood quietly by the wall, his reservation survey papers held neatly in one hand. Sergeant Matthews positioned himself near the door, his army uniform a reminder of order. Cold winter light filtered through the high windows as Judge Nestor Hawley entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The room rose, then settled. At his gesture, the judge adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and opened a leather-bound docket. "Case regarding contested water rights at Dry Willow Spring," he announced, voice carrying to the rafters. "Railroad petition to invalidate Mayhew deed." Purdy's lawyer rose first, his suit as slick as his manner. "Your Honor," he began, boots clicking on the wooden floor as he approached the bench. "The Mayhew deed is clearly defective. That spring was always intended for railroad use. The company's development plans require. The company's plans are not evidence." Judge Hawley interrupted, peering over his glasses. "Present your legal argument." Betty's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the back and forth. The lawyer produced several documents, each one suggesting different railroad claims to the water. None seemed to show clear ownership. "Miss Mayhew," Judge Hawley called, "please approach." Betty rose carefully, clutching the Bible and deed. Reverend Caldwell stepped forward with her, Thomas Red Elk moving to her other side. Sergeant Matthews shifted closer, his presence steady and watchful. The judge nodded at the group, You may proceed, Miss Mayhew. Betty's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the Bible to the ribbon-marked pages. Her voice grew stronger as she read the deed's careful description of boundaries and water rights. The courthouse fell silent, dust motes dancing in the pale sunlight as her words filled the room. Your Honor, she continued, presenting the certified copy, this shows the spring lies within our marked boundary. Thomas Red Elk stepped forward, offering his survey notes that confirmed her words. Judge Holly studied the documents carefully, paying particular attention to the witness clause. His finger traced a line requiring both pastor and agency clerk to approve any transfer. This is quite specific, he noted, looking up at Purdy's lawyer. Without these witnesses, no valid sale could have occurred. Do you have documentation showing such approval? The lawyer shifted his weight. We have record of a standing option, Your Honor. If you'll allow objection, Betty said, surprising herself with her clarity. No option could be valid without the required witnesses. Sustained, Judge Holly said. He removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully with a cloth. This requires examination of the railroad's complete records. I hereby order their ledger. Custodian to appear with all relevant documents. He picked up a small gavel. Court will recess until Monday morning to allow time for the express rider to deliver these records. The telegraph office will send immediate summons. The gavel struck. Wood with finality. People began filing out, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Betty remained standing, her fingers white-knuckled around the Bible. Miss Mayhew, Judge Holly said quietly, your father's foresight in requiring these witnesses appears most prudent. We will see what the railroad's own books reveal. The afternoon sun had begun its winter descent when Betty made her way to the jailhouse. Reverend Caldwell had offered his parsonage again for the night, but first she needed to see Robert dot the wall of the jail through long shadows across the muddy street. Betty found the barred window where she knew Robert's cell to be. Her boots crunched in the crusty snow as she approached. Robert? She called softly. His face appeared at the window, lined with concern. How did it go? The judge wants to see the railroad's books. We wait until Monday. Robert's hand reached through the bars. Betty stepped closer, lacing her fingers through the cold iron to touch his palm. Despite the metal between them, she felt the warmth of his skin, the strength in his gentle grip. You did well, he said, voice low and sure. Standing up there, speaking truth. I was scared, she admitted. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Robert replied. It means doing what's right anyway. They stood there as dusk gathered, hands joined through the bars, while overhead the first stars began to glimmer in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring Sunday services, then Monday's reckoning with the railroad's records. But for now, this moment of connection was enough. The jail's iron door groaned in protest as old Mr. Toomey worked his key in the lock. 5 minutes, he said softly, nodding to Betty and Reverend Caldwell. Your father was a good man, Miss Mayhew. Did me kindnesses I won't forget. Betty stepped into the narrow corridor, lamplight throwing shadows against the rough stone walls. Robert stood at his cell bars, the bruise on his temple dark against his pale skin. The Reverend maintained a respectful distance, his Bible held before him like a shield. Betty, Robert breathed her name like a prayer. His fingers reached through the bars to touch hers. Despite the chill of the cell block, his hand was warm and strong. I'll stand firm, she whispered, just as you said. Robert's eyes held hers, steady and sure. The Lord made you strong, Betty. I meant what I said before. I'll carry you when needed, and you'll carry our sons. His voice caught slightly on the word sons, full of hope and promise. I'll be back at dawn, Betty promised, squeezing his fingers one last time before Mr. Toomey jingled his keys in gentle reminder. Sunday morning dawned heavy and hushed, the sky pregnant with snow. Betty walked to church through streets muffled by clouds, her boots leaving fresh prints in yesterday's crusted drifts. Inside the white-painted sanctuary, oil lamps cast a warm glow against dark windows. Reverend Caldwell took his place at the pulpit, his familiar voice rising and falling like music as he preached on steadfastness. In times of trial, he intoned, we must hold fast to what is right and true. During the offering, Lila Greyhawk moved through the pews with quiet grace, her collection plate extended. Betty watched as weather-worn hands reached out miners, and shopkeepers alike dropping coins with gentle clinks. She recognized the gesture for what it was, help for her legal costs, offered without words or expectation. The afternoon stretched long and gray. Word spread through town the express. Ryder was struggling through deep drifts with the railroad's ledger. Betty tried not to count the hours, focusing instead on practical tasks. In the parsonage kitchen, she and Lila worked side by side, their movements easy and familiar as they prepared a pot of beans. The warm, homey scent filled the small space, drawing in two railroad trackmen who hesitated in the doorway. Come in, Betty invited, ladling portions into tin bowls. The men sat at the scarred wooden table, caps in their hands. Miss Mayhew, the older one began, his voice rough with shame, we need to tell you something. About the maps Purdy had us sign. His companion nodded. He said we'd lose our jobs if we didn't mark the spring where he wanted. We're right, though. We know that now. Betty found paper and pencil, writing down their names with steady hands. Will you tell the judge? Both men nodded. Truth needs telling, the older one said simply. Night settled over Silver Vein like a heavy blanket. In the parsonage's small sitting room, Betty sat alone with her father's Bible. She tore a careful strip from a piece of writing paper and dipped her pen in ink. Lord, she wrote, grant us wisdom to see your path and courage to walk it. She folded the prayer small and tucked it between the blue ribbons marking the deed's description. The town clock had just struck midnight when hoofbeats echoed through the empty streets. Betty hurried to the window, pressing her face to the cold glass. Through the swirling snow, she made out a horse and rider, both so covered in white they looked like spirits. The express rider nearly fell from his saddle, his clothes frozen stiff. Two men caught him as he stumbled, while others rushed to lead his exhausted horse to the livery's warmth. In his arms, he clutched an iron-bound chest, the railroad's ledger. Safe at last. Betty watched as the town marshal and judge's clerk carried the precious chest to the courthouse vault. Tomorrow, those pages would speak their truth. For now, she bowed her head and whispered thanks for safe arrival through the storm. Through the window, she could just make out the jail where Robert waited. The snow fell steadily, each flake a promise of morning, of justice, of hope. She touched the Bible where her prayer rested among the ribbons and thought of Robert's words. The Lord made you strong. The courthouse windows were still dark when Betty arrived Monday morning, her father's Bible pressed close against a coat. Lila Greyhawk stood beside her, a steadying presence in the gray dawn. One by one, townspeople filed into the wooden benches, their boots leaving wet trails on the plank floor. Judge Nestor Hall entered precisely at 7 o'clock, his black robes rustling as he took his seat. The room fell silent save for the tick of the wall clock and the whisper of papers being arranged. Bring forth the railroad ledger, Judge Hawley commanded, his voice carrying to the farthest corner. The clerk approached with reverence, bearing the iron-bound chest. The key turned with a solid click that echoed through the hushed chamber. Inside, leather-bound volumes lay in precise rows, their pages edged in gold leaf. The clerk lifted out the most recent ledger and opened it carefully. On his desk, Betty held her breath as he turned the pages, tracking columns of neat figures with his finger. Your Honor, the clerk announced, I find an option recorded for Dry Willow Ranch." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. However, the option expired. Without exercise 3 years ago. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Holly leaned forward. "Continue." The clerk turned another page and stopped abruptly. His face went pale. "There appears to be a later entry. A transfer of deeds signed by Jonathan Mayhew." He swallowed hard. "Dated 3 months after Reverend Caldwell conducted his funeral." Gasps filled the room. Betty's hands tightened on the Bible as she turned to look at Silas Purdy. The railroad agent's face had drained of all color, his fingers gripping the rail before him. "The signature is countersigned by Silas Purdy as witness," the clerk finished. Quietly, before Judge Holly could speak, Reverend Caldwell rose from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may?" The judge nodded, his stern face unchanged. "I have here," the Reverend said, producing a folded paper from his coat, "a receipt for a church loan that Jonathan Mayhew and I co-signed, with Dry Willow Ranch as security." He stepped forward, offering the document. "It was repaid in full before his passing. I present this to show there can be no other claim or lien against the property." Thomas Red Elk stood next, his bearing dignified. "The reservation's treaty maps," he said clearly, "recognize Dry Willow as a community watering place provided the owner permits fair access." He turned to Betty with a slight bow. "Miss Mayhew has already honored this through custom, allowing both settlers and tribal members to water their stock." Judge Hollis studied the documents before him in silence. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Finally, he looked up, his gaze fixing on Purdy. "The deed to Dry Willow Ranch held by Elizabeth Mayhew Boone is hereby declared valid and binding," he pronounced. "Mr. Boone is to be released from custody immediately." He paused, his voice hardening. "And I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Silas Purdy on charges of forgery and fraud." The army sergeant who had been standing at attention moved swiftly to Purdy's side. The railroad agent offered no resistance as iron cuffs clicked around his wrists. Approving murmurs filled the room as Purdy was led away. Betty barely heard them. She was already moving toward the door, her heart pounding. In the marble-floored hall, she heard familiar footsteps. Robert appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing his jail-creased clothes. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the space. Then Robert opened his arms, and Betty flew into them. He held her carefully, as if she were made of glass. Those arms trembled with emotion. Betty pressed her face into his shoulder, tears soaking into his rough shirt. She felt his chest shake with something between a laugh and a sob. "The Lord provides," Robert whispered into her hair. "He does indeed," Betty managed through her tears. Around them, the courthouse stirred to life as people filed past. Some nodded approval, others smiled openly. Lila touched Betty's shoulder as she passed, her dark eyes warm with friendship. Thomas Red Elk inclined his head to them both before departing. Reverend Caldwell beamed like a proud father as he descended the stairs, but Betty and Robert remained still in their embrace, their hearts beating in time, their future stretching before them like a path made straight and true dot by midday. The winter sun hung bright in a pearl-white sky as townsfolk crowded the courthouse boardwalk. Steam rose from coffee cups while neighbors shared news of the verdict. Betty stood close to Robert's side, still scarcely believing the morning's victory. Judge Holly emerged from the courthouse, his black robes replaced by a formal coat. He raised his hand for attention, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "Mr. Boone," the judge said, his voice carrying across the gathered faces, "I offer the court's formal apology for your wrongful imprisonment. Such abuse of law will not stand in this jurisdiction." Robert squared his shoulders and faced the gathering. His voice rang steady and clear in the cold air. "This is my wife," he declared, his hand finding Betty's. The Lord made her strong to carry my sons, and I will carry her every day if I must." Applause rose from the crowd, starting soft, then swelling like thunder. Betty felt tears prick her eyes as she saw genuine warmth in faces that had once held only mockery. Robert's fingers tightened protectively around hers. Through the crowd, Layla's two small boys pushed forward, their dark eyes bright with purpose. The younger one held out a carefully whittled stick of willow wood, its pale surface marked with simple carvings. "For the orchard," the older boy explained shyly. "Mama says willows mean new beginnings." Betty knelt carefully to accept their gift, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said softly. "You must come visit when the trees bloom." Reverend Caldwell stepped forward then, gently guiding two children toward them. A boy of about 10 stood protective beside his younger sister, both wearing clothes that showed signs of smoke and hasty washing. "This is Will and Maddie," the Reverend explained. "Their parents' line shack burned 3 days ago. I wondered if you might supervise their meals at church this week. They need a woman's guidance while we arrange permanent care." Betty looked at the children's tired faces, remembering her own losses. "Of course we will," she said without hesitation. She glanced at Robert, who nodded his ready agreement. "Much obliged," Will said formally, though his eyes betrayed hunger beneath the brave front dot. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Robert and Betty made their way to the Mercantile. The store bell chimed as they entered to fulfill their long-delayed plans. The shopkeeper produced his spring catalog, and they carefully selected 6 apple saplings for delivery when the weather warmed. "Best stock from back east," the merchant assured them, writing up the order. "And I have that seed wheat you asked about last week." They added the heavy bag of wheat to their purchases, Robert's eyes already planning next season's fields. As they loaded their wagon, townspeople appeared with offerings: flour from the miller's wife, blankets from the seamstress, preserved from the schoolmarm's pantry. "For your fresh start," the telegraph clerk said, adding his own contribution of lamp oil and matches, and to make up for lost time. Betty thanked each one, her heart full at this outpouring of neighborly care. Even the miners who had once jeered now touched their hats respectfully as they passed. The schoolmarm pressed a primer into Betty's hands. "For when you need it," she said, with a knowing smile. As dusk gathered in purple waves across the snow-bright sky, Robert carefully secured their load. He checked each rope twice, making sure nothing would shift on the cold drive home. Betty wrapped herself in the new blankets, leaving space beside her for Robert on the wagon seat. From the church steps, Will and Maddie waved farewell, their small figures bright against the weathered wood. Betty waved back, already planning what she would cook for Sunday's meal. Fresh snow began to fall in lazy spirals, catching the last light like falling stars. Robert clicked to the horses, and the wagon creaked into motion. Betty felt the familiar sway as they started the long drive home, but now the motion carried promise instead of uncertainty. The lantern swung gently from its hook, casting pools of golden light across the gathering dark. She touched the willow twig in her pocket and smiled, thinking of orchards yet to bloom, of children's voices yet to fill empty rooms, of love growing steady as trees take root in fertile soil. Above them, the first evening star winked through breaks in the clouds, lighting their way home to Dry Willow Ranch. Tuesday dawn painted the mountain sky in pale gold, casting long shadows across the fresh snow at Dry Willow Ranch. The wagon stood half-emptied in the yard, its contents waiting to be sorted and stored. Inside the cabin, Betty stirred a pot of porridge warming on the iron stove while Robert carried in the last of their supplies from town. Steam rose from their breakfast bowls as they planned their morning's work. "The saplings need shelter from the wind," Robert said, spreading out a rough sketch on the table. "We will build frames on the south side, where the ground thaws first. After the dishes were dried, they stepped into the crisp morning air. Robert paced out the spacing while Betty gathered straw for mulching. Together they worked the earth where it had softened in sheltered patches, preparing homes for their first 2 apple trees. "These hardy ones might just take," Robert said, carefully placing the first sapling. "With proper care and the Lord's blessing." Betty packed straw around the slender trunk, remembering Lila's boys and their gift of carved willow. As if summoned by the thought, hoofbeats sounded from the trail. Lila Greyhawk appeared, riding her dappled mare with her sons behind her on a pony. She carried a covered basket that clinked with promise. "Seeds," she explained, dismounting gracefully. "For your garden when spring comes." My grandmother's line, saved through many winters. The children helped hammer stakes for the windbreaks while the adults stretched canvas between the frames. When the work was done, they gathered in a circle near the newly planted trees. Betty's clear voice rose first in a hymn of thanksgiving, joined by Lila's rich alto and the boys' sweet treble. Robert's deeper tones completed the harmony that drifted across the yard. Lila offered a prayer in both Comanche and English, asking, "Blessing on the orchard and all who might rest in its shade, neighbors, cattlemen, and passing tribal kin alike." The words settled like a mantle of peace over the small gathering dot as Lila and her boys prepared to leave. Another sleigh appeared on the trail. Midwife Alma Pritchard pulled up in her familiar cutter, her face tired but content from attending. "A birth in the night. Just a moment to check on you, Betty," she said, stepping down. "Then I must get home to sleep." In the privacy of the cabin, Alma listened to Betty's breathing and checked her pulse. "You are doing well," she said warmly. "Take this herb tea. It will help with strength." She left careful instructions for brewing before taking her leave. The afternoon passed in steady work. Robert repaired a loose hinge on the barn door while Betty sat at the table, penning a careful note to Will and Mattie. She invited them to Sunday supper, weather permitting, adding that she would make apple dumplings if they came dod, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Robert and Betty walked hand in hand to the spring. Steam curled from its surface, where the water bubbled up from deep underground, defying winter's grip. They stood quietly, watching the mist rise and drift away. "Sons may come by birth or by heart," Betty said softly, thinking of the orphan children in town. Robert smiled, squeezing her hand. "Either way, the Lord multiplies." Inside the warm cabin, lamplight gleamed on the fresh quilts and the Bible, lying open on the table. Its blue ribbons marked Psalm 23, the familiar words offering comfort. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Snow began falling again, hushing the world beneath its gentle weight. Through the window, the small orchard stood dark against the star-filled sky, its protective frames like open arms welcoming all who might come. Betty and Robert sat close by the stove, no longer unwanted, but anchored in faith and surrounded by the promise of family yet to come. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.